Do you think track of the juror numbers and identities in the course of the trial. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I will start by asking you all to please stand. I'm going to swear you in for this trial. I'll ask that you all please raise your right hand. Will the defense and Mr. Castiglione also please stand, face the jury? Ladies and gentlemen, at the conclusion of this oath, will you each please say, "I do"? Do you solemnly affirm that you will carefully consider the evidence and the law presented to you in this case, and that you will deliver a fair and true verdict as to the charges against the defendant?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated. Mr. Castiglione, if you please remain standing. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now read to you the complaints or the indictments alleged against this defendant. First is charge ID 1805389C. An indictment at the Superior Court, Holden at Concord, convened a statewide grand jury upon the 2nd day of November in the year of our Lord 2020. The grand jurors for the state of New Hampshire, upon their oath, present that Brandon M. Castiglione, of or formerly of Londonderry, New Hampshire, on or about the 1st day of October 2019 at Londonderry in the county of Rockingham, aforesaid, with force and arms, did commit the crime of second-degree murder. In that, Brandon M. Castiglione did knowingly cause the death of Luis Garcia by shooting Mr. Garcia through the neck with a firearm, resulting in his death. Next is charge ID 1674110C, an indictment alleging that Brandon M. Castiglione, on or about the 1st day of October 2019 at Londonderry in the county of Rockingham, aforesaid, with force and arms, did commit the crime of second-degree murder. In that, Brandon M. Castiglione did recklessly cause the death of Luis Garcia under circumstances manifesting an extreme indifference to the value of human life by shooting Mr. Garcia in the neck with a firearm, resulting in his death. Said acts being contrary to the form of the statute in such case made and provided and against the peace and dignity of the state. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant, Brandon Castiglione, has been arraigned on these indictments, and he has pleaded not guilty. And of this he puts himself upon his country for trial, which country you are. The Assistant Attorney Generals for the state have joined in this issue, and you are to say by your verdict if the defendant, Brandon Castiglione, is guilty of the crimes whereof he stands indicted or not guilty. Please give your full attention to the evidence. Mr. Castiglione and counsel, you may be seated.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As I mentioned at the beginning of the trial, my name is Judge Ruoff. And I'm going to go through a couple of housekeeping matters with you. And then I will read some basic introductory statements, and then we'll get to opening statements. First thing is, I warned you yesterday, throughout the course of the trial, you're not allowed to do any independent research. You're not allowed to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anybody else for that matter. You're not supposed to go on MapQuest or Google Maps and look up locations of anything. No independent research whatsoever. All the information you should need to decide this case you'll get within this courtroom. The other thing is, I want to call to your attention, as you've noticed, there's really only one way in and one way out of this building. So you jurors, as well as members of the public and people involved in this case, will be coming and going through the same door. That's why we give you the juror identification pin, so that everybody knows who you are. Hopefully they give you the pin, so they'll give them to you on the way out, so that everybody knows who you are, including the folks downstairs and including the parties. They're under obligation not to have any contact with you. So if you happen to see them and say hi to them or good morning, they may just nod, but they're not allowed to have any contact with you whatsoever. They're not being impolite, they're just abiding by the rules of court, okay? And that's part of the process, that you're not allowed to have any contact with anybody outside of the context of this case, okay? That being said, I'm going to read some instructions to you that apply throughout the course of the trial. I read them because they're part of the record of the case, and these are instructions that are given in every criminal case throughout the state of New Hampshire. So if you've served on a jury before, many of these will probably sound familiar to you. I'm going to give you some general instructions about the law that applies to this case and as to a few other matters. which will give you some guidance as you consider the evidence in this case. And at the end of the case, I will give you further instructions, and then you will retire to the jury deliberation room to decide your verdict. It is your duty as jurors to follow all the instructions I give you. Regardless of any opinion you may have as to what the law ought to be, the law as I explain it to you is the law you must follow in reaching your verdict. Also, you must consider all the instructions which I give you, regardless of the order in which I give them. You must not single out any particular instruction alone as stating the law. Rather, you should consider each instruction in light of and together with the others. You are to give them the same weight and consideration. It is up to you to decide the facts of this case. You must decide the facts solely from the evidence in this trial. You must apply to the law given to you in these instructions to the facts, and in this way reach a fair and just verdict. You should decide the facts in this case without prejudice, without fear, and without sympathy. Now, the evidence consists of the testimony under oath of the witnesses and the exhibits. Now, there are certain other matters that you may not consider as evidence, and I will discuss those matters first, and then I will turn to a discussion of what you may consider. As you know from the clerk's reading of the charges, the defendant in this case stands accused of second-degree murder. I will explain the legal definition of this crime in more detail at the conclusion of this case. The fact that the defendant has been arrested and charged is not evidence of guilt. A charge is simply a way of giving the defendant notice of the accusations against him. It is a formal way of accusing the defendant of a crime in order to bring him to trial. You must not consider the fact that the defendant has been charged as evidence of guilt of the defendant. The possible punishment of the defendant should not influence your decision. The duty of imposing sentence is for the judge. You should consider the evidence presented and base your verdict only on the evidence without considering the issue of punishment. You will hear the lawyers discuss the facts and the law and their arguments to you. These arguments, or any statements made by counsel during the course of the trial, are not evidence. The lawyers are not witnesses. Their purpose is to help you understand the evidence and the law. And if the lawyers state the law differently from the law as I explain it to you in these instructions, then you must follow these instructions and ignore the statements of the lawyers. If the lawyers state the evidence differently from how you recall it, then you should follow your own memory of what the evidence was. That is why you must pay attention to the evidence. You will not get a transcript of the testimony. During the trial, the lawyers may make objections. The lawyers are supposed to object when they believe that certain evidence is not admissible. If I sustain an objection or exclude any evidence, you must not guess as to what the answer or evidence would have been. If I order that a question and answer be stricken from the record, you must not consider either the question or the answer as evidence. Now, I might allow some evidence to be admitted for a limited purpose. You may only use any such evidence for that purpose that I instruct you that it may be used for. Now, throughout the trial, I do my best to remain fair and impartial, just as you are required to be. If you think that I express or suggest an opinion as to the facts in my rulings, you should ignore such an opinion. It is up to you alone to decide the facts in this case. The role of the judge is to run the trial in a fair and orderly manner, to decide the admissibility of evidence, and to give these instructions. My role is very different than yours. Thus, if you observe me taking down notes during the testimony, you should not attach any significance to the fact that I am taking notes. I have to keep track of different things during the course of the trial, and that's what I use my laptop for. As you were instructed during the general selection process, there is a presumption of innocence that applies and continues throughout this trial until the state convinces you, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant is guilty of each and every element of the offense with which he has been charged. And the defendant has no obligation whatsoever to prove his innocence in this matter, and that includes the absolute right not to testify if he so chooses. You are not allowed to draw any unfavorable, adverse, or negative inference if the defendant chooses not to testify in this matter. Now, having addressed what you cannot consider in deciding this case, I will now turn to what you should consider. You should consider only the legally admissible evidence, and that is the testimony of the witnesses and the exhibits. Now, there are two kinds of evidence, direct and circumstantial. Direct evidence is direct proof of a fact, such as the testimony or statements of a person about what the person saw, heard, or did. Circumstantial evidence is indirect evidence. That is, it's proof of a chain of facts from which you could find that another fact exists, although it hasn't been proved directly. For example, if you look outside and see water droplets falling from the sky, that is direct evidence that it's raining. But if you look out the window at night and the ground is dry, and again the next morning and the ground is wet, that is indirect or circumstantial evidence that it rained during the night. By circumstantial evidence, I simply mean that you may infer the ultimate fact from other facts that have been proven. Conversely, you may not reach conclusions based on facts that have not been proven. Now, in the rain example, wet ground alone may support an inference that it rained during the night. But in the absence of additional evidence, it will not necessarily support an inference about how much rain fell or for how long a period of time. You should consider both kinds of evidence. You are permitted to give equal weight to both. But it is for you to decide how much weight to give any evidence, whether it's direct or circumstantial. However, to be sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, circumstantial evidence must exclude all other reasonable conclusions. This means that if from the circumstantial evidence it's reasonable to arrive at two conclusions, one consistent with guilt and one consistent with innocence, then you must choose the reasonable conclusion consistent with innocence. However, you do not consider each item of circumstantial evidence in isolation. In determining whether all other reasonable conclusions have been excluded, you should consider each item of circumstantial evidence in the context of all the other evidence, which includes other circumstantial evidence and direct evidence. Additionally, this circumstantial evidence rule does not apply to direct evidence. Therefore, if there's a conflict between the witnesses who offered direct evidence concerning certain facts, you must decide which witness of either to believe. For example, suppose there are two eyewitnesses to a crime, and one testifies that the defendant committed the crime, and the other testifies that the defendant did not commit the crime. This presents a situation where there is a conflict in the direct evidence. In this situation, you, the jury, must decide which witness, if either, to believe, and whether, based on all the evidence, the state has proven the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In sum, you should consider all the direct and circumstantial evidence in the case, as well as any reasonable inferences you draw therefrom, in deciding whether the state has proved all the elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. In reviewing the evidence, you should consider the quality of the evidence and not the quantity. It's not the number of witnesses or quantity of evidence that is important, but the quality of the evidence that is important. In deciding whether the state has proved the charge against the defendant beyond a reasonable doubt, you must decide the credibility of witnesses. That is, it is up to you to decide who to believe. If there is any conflict between the witnesses, then you must resolve the conflict. Simply because a witness has taken an oath to tell the truth does not mean that you have to accept the testimony as true. Use your common sense and judgment. Consider those factors you use in deciding important issues in your everyday lives. For example, you may consider the witness's appearance, attitude, and behavior on the witness stand and the way the witness testified. The witness's age, intelligence, and experience. The witness's opportunity and ability to see or hear the things about which the witness testified. The accuracy of the witness's testimony. The witness's memory. Any motive of the witness not to tell the truth. Any interest that a witness had in the outcome of the case. Any bias the witness or friendship or animosity the witness may have for or against any of the other people in the case. The consistency or inconsistency of the witness's testimony. Whether or not what the witness said appears reasonable or unreasonable. Whether what the witness said is consistent or inconsistent with the testimony of other witnesses, or with statements the witness made at another time. Now, in deciding which witnesses to believe and how much of their testimony to believe, you should consider both the direct and cross-examination of the witness. If you believe that part of a witness's testimony is false, you may choose to distrust other parts also, but you are not required to do so. Inconsistencies and contradictions within a witness's testimony or between witnesses do not necessarily mean that you should disbelieve the witness. It is possible for honest people to witness the same event and see or hear things differently. You should evaluate inconsistencies and contradictions and determine whether they are important or unimportant. You need not believe any witness even though the testimony is uncontradicted. Nor are you required to accept testimony as true simply because some or even all the witnesses agree with each other. You may find the testimony of one witness or of a few witnesses more persuasive than the testimony of a larger number. Now, these principles apply to all witnesses, whether they are ordinary citizens, police officers, or otherwise. In short, you should consider the testimony of each witness and give it the weight you, the jury, think it deserves. You can accept all of what a witness said, you can reject all of it, or you can accept part and reject part. That determination is exclusively yours to make. Now, I've addressed what you should not consider and what you should consider in rendering a verdict. Now I'm going to discuss how convinced one way or the other you must be, and this is referred to as the burden of proof. Under our constitutions, all defendants in criminal cases are presumed to be innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden of proving guilt is entirely on the state. The defendant does not have to prove his innocence. The defendant enters this courtroom as an innocent person, and you must consider him to be an innocent person until the state convinces you beyond a reasonable doubt that he is guilty of every element of the alleged offense. If, after all the evidence and arguments, you have a reasonable doubt as to the defendant having committed any one or more of the elements of the offense, then you must find him not guilty. A reasonable doubt is just what the words ordinarily imply. The use of the word reasonable means simply that the doubt must be reasonable rather than unreasonable. It must be a doubt based on reason. It's not a frivolous or fanciful doubt, nor is it one that can easily be explained away. Rather, it's such a doubt based on reason as remains after consideration of all the evidence the state has offered against it. The test you must use is this. If you have a reasonable doubt as to whether the state has proved any one or more of the elements of the crime charged, you must find the defendant not guilty. However, if you find the state has proved all the elements of the offense charged beyond a reasonable doubt, you should find the defendant guilty. After all the evidence has been submitted and both sides have presented their closing arguments, I will give you further instructions about the law that applies to this case, including the legal definition of the crimes charged in this case and other issues that might arise during the course of the trial. You are to consider the instructions as a whole, both the instructions I give now and the ones I will give at the end of the case, and not single out any one particular instruction as stating the law. You will also have a written copy of my entire instructions with you in the jury deliberation room. Counsel?
Thank you, Judge. On October 1st, 2019, Luis Garcia was senselessly shot in the back of his head and killed by this man, Brandon Castiglione. If that sounds simple to you to say it that way, it's because it is simple. This is not a case of some complicated mystery where we're trying to figure out who killed Luis. The defendant did it, and the evidence you'll hear throughout this trial will prove it. One bullet, one casing, one pistol, and one man, Brandon Castiglione. And this is slide 7. All found within feet of Luis's body. In the room directly next to the defendant's bedroom, and in the hall just outside that room. That's the room where Luis had been doing some sanding and painting for the defendant's father, Mark, in their home at 15 Ridgemont Drive in Londonderry, New Hampshire. Now, you're not going to hear evidence from the state in this case about why Brandon shot and killed Luis Garcia. The fact of the matter is, not every act can be explained, especially one so senseless. But as the judge will explain to you later, motive is not an element of the crime of second-degree murder. You will, however, hear evidence showing that the one bullet and one casing were the same make and manufacture as an ammunition box kept in the defendant's bedside drawer, and that one pistol found just outside the room, a Glock 19 9mm, was the defendant's. And he kept that pistol, he kept his Glock 19 in its case, in the drawer, right next to his bed. You're going to hear in this trial that the defendant and Mr. Garcia met through their church, New England Pentecostal, in Pelham, New Hampshire. Their families also met through that church, and they met about a year and a half before the defendant shot and killed Luis. In the weeks leading up to October 1st of 2019, Luis was working, as I said, in the defendant's home in Londonderry. That's a home that's owned by Mark Castiglione, the defendant's father, and the defendant and his dad were the only two people living in that home at the time. Luis had spent about 2 or 3 weeks before that day going room to room, doing small repairs and renovations for Mark. He had stripped wallpaper, sanded, and painted some rooms. And on that day, he was working in the last bedroom on the left down the hallway. He was sanding and painting. It was a room that Mark had turned into an office, and at the time, all of the furniture had been moved to the center of the room and was covered with a painter's tarp. Now, during those 2 or 3 weeks, you'll hear, as we expect you'll hear, from Mark Castiglione himself, that he would leave for work around 6 a.m. every workday. And he'd travel to Billerica, Mass., where his job was, and he'd stay there until he came home in the afternoon or evening. Luis, as you'll hear, would leave his house in Manchester around 8 a.m. every day. And he'd travel to Londonderry about 20 or 25 minutes to the Castiglione residence. And he'd stay there while he worked on whatever project he was working on. For the rest of the day after Luis would arrive, it would be him and the defendant inside that home. You're going to hear that on days that Luis was working in that house, Mark Castiglione would regularly call him on his first break of the day at 9:30. He'd call him to check in on progress that he was making, to see what room he was working on that day. And as Mark would put it, Luis answered those calls consistently. But that changed on October 1st, 2019. Because on that morning, Luis did not answer Mark's calls. Through the trial, you'll see and hear evidence that Mark didn't just call at 9:30, he called again at 11:42 and again at 12:14, each time without an answer from Luis. You're also going to hear and see evidence that Mark would call his son, the defendant, each time he tried calling Luis. But each time, the defendant also would not answer his phone. So Mark eventually got in touch with his daughter, Danielle Padalano. And Danielle in turn got in touch with Frances Pastana, or Fran. Well, Frances and her husband Jeff also knew Luis and his wife Patty through the church. And in fact, Luis and his wife Patty had lived with Fran and Jeff for a short time after they moved to New Hampshire from Massachusetts. So Frances tried calling Luis's phone. Frances tried calling Patty, Luis's wife. And then Patty tried calling Luis. Nobody could get in touch with him. And they all thought this was odd or concerning, as you'll hear, that no one could reach Luis. So Danielle, the defendant's sister, and Fran, his grandmother, finally decided to go to 15 Ridgemont Drive, where they knew, and where Mark knew, and where Patty knew that Luis was supposed to be that day, and that's where the defendant was as well. You're going to hear that when they got there, Luis's car was in the driveway, but the house was locked up. Just like their phone calls, Fran and Danielle's yelling and calling into the house went unanswered. Danielle tried the front door, she tried the back door. Like I said, they tried yelling, and they tried throwing acorns or pebbles at the windows of the house, including this top left corner. That window is where they saw a light on. And Danielle recognized that as her old bedroom, the last room on the left at the end of the hall. Despite all their efforts, still nothing from inside, no response. So Danielle, concerned for her brother and for Luis, called her dad, Mark, and Mark told her about the key he had been leaving for Luis under the front mat. He'd left it so Luis could get into the house early in the morning when Brandon would still be sleeping. She found the key right where Mark kept it. She unlocked the door and went inside. She went up the stairs. She went down the hall to the left, toward her old bedroom at the end of the hall. this doorway on the left here. And that was the room where Luis had been working that morning. Like I said, that office furniture was moved to the center of the room. You're going to hear that when Danielle got to that room, she found her brother, the defendant, just inside the door. He was on his hands and knees, and he was mumbling, but words she couldn't quite understand. He was unharmed and uninjured. Luis Garcia, on the other hand, lay dead on the other side of that furniture in the room, trapped between the furniture and the wall he had just been sanding. Danielle ran back outside to her grandmother and told her what she had seen, and then Fran went inside. And Fran found the defendant in that same room, her grandson, right where Danielle had seen him, and then she made her way around that furniture to look at Luis. She saw him lying on the floor, blood pooling around his head and surrounding him. The two women called 911 immediately, and Londonderry officers went to the house. When they entered the house, they saw several crucial things. First was at the end of this hallway, that pistol on top of that plastic set of drawers. And then slide 17, inside the room, they found the defendant in this area here, just feet away from Luis. You'll hear that they found a bullet casing between the two men. They found a bullet between the two men. One bullet, one casing, one pistol, one killer in the room with Luis. Now that bullet and the casing were sent to the New Hampshire State Laboratory, where they were analyzed by criminalist Jill Terrio, an expert from whom you'll hear that both the casing and the bullet were linked to that gun found in the hallway, the defendant's gun. The Glock 19 9mm, serial number TSA 446. She'll also explain to you that the casing and the bullet were 9mm solid copper hollow point, marketed by a brand called Fiachi. The pistol was also sent to the New Hampshire State Laboratory, where it was analyzed for fingerprints by criminalist Rachel Martinez. You'll hear from her that the only fingerprint found on that gun was Brandon Castiglione's. You'll also hear throughout this trial that when New Hampshire State Police investigators got on the scene, in the house, they found that the doors, other than the front door, which Danielle had opened, were locked. The windows were shut. There was property inside, items in front of the windows, obstructing them. They found no indication that anyone had entered that house other than Luis Garcia when he got there that morning, and Danielle Padalano when she unlocked the door, and Fran when she followed. You're going to hear from Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Jenny Duval, who did an autopsy on Luis's body. She's going to explain to you that Mr. Garcia, Luis, was shot from behind, that the bullet entered the right base of his skull and exited the left front of his neck. Dr. Duval will explain that that gunshot was not self-inflicted and that it was from fairly close range. She'll also tell you about the untold damage that that bullet caused Luis's spinal cord. It caused him to immediately collapse and bleed out on the floor of that room, where the defendant and his bullet and his casing were found with him. His gun just outside the door. No matter the reason why the defendant shot and killed Luis Garcia, the fact remains that he did. And the law governing the defendant's actions is clear. The crime of second-degree murder will be proven in this case by demonstrating that the defendant, with the requisite criminal intent, caused the death of Luis Garcia by shooting him through the neck. While there are no independent eyewitnesses to exactly what the defendant said or what he was thinking when he pulled that trigger, the injuries he caused show his criminal intent and the act. Judge Ruoff will later instruct you that the law criminalizes the murder, regardless of the motive for his criminal intent or the act. So 1 bullet and 1 casing, the defendant's. 1 pistol, the defendant's, with his fingerprint on it. And 1 man, 1 killer, the defendant found in the room with Luis Garcia, having been inside that house when it was locked during that day. He was found feet away from Luis, having not called 911, having not answered his phone, having not answered his family members' calls from outside the house. While it may not make sense, the fact remains. This man shot and killed Luis Garcia, a husband, father, grandfather, valued member of his church and community, an innocent and just man. And the defendant did it with his gun and his bullet. The evidence will prove that. And so at the end of this trial, we will ask you to find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder.
This case is about jumping to conclusions. The police found Brandon praying in the doorway of the room where Luis Garcia lay dead, and they jumped to a conclusion. Within minutes of finding him there, Brandon was handcuffed in the back of a police car. And because the police jumped to that conclusion, they did not do a thorough investigation. You're going to hear about things that the police should have done in this case that they simply did not do. You're also going to hear that the police only looked for evidence that pointed towards Brandon. The police jumped to conclusions. They did not do a thorough investigation. They only looked for evidence that pointed to Brandon. That's what this case is about. Now, as the judge told you, Brandon sits here in this courtroom, an innocent man. The government has to prove that he did what they're accusing him of. The government has to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. You must consider Brandon to be innocent unless and until the government meets that word. Now, those 4 words, beyond a reasonable doubt, are important. They're the highest standard we have in our legal system. I want to talk to you about some of the reasons you're going to have to doubt the government's case. As I indicated, the police jumped to conclusions. When the first officer arrived, it's a patrol officer, he finds Brandon kneeling, praying in the doorway. Within 5 minutes, Brandon is under arrest. He's handcuffed. He's in the back of a police car. And ladies and gentlemen, Brandon is in the back of that police car long before major crimes arrived, long before the detectives who were actually investigating a homicide arrived. They know that Brandon has been arrested long before they get there. And that fact affects everything that they did going forward. Because the police jumped to conclusions. They did not do a thorough investigation. I want to talk to you about one thing that shows that. There will be others. But I want to start out talking to you about evidence that was collected, but that the police didn't bother to test. You heard that Luis Garcia was shot. The police knew they were investigating a shooting. Now, when a bullet is fired out of a gun, there are two parts in a bullet. There's the outer part, the casing, and then there's the bullet itself. And in between the two, there's some gunpowder. And when the gun fires, that powder explodes, and that's what shoots the bullet out of the barrel of the gun. When that powder explodes, it goes over everything that's really nearby. It gets on the hands of whoever is firing the gun. It gets on the clothing of whoever is firing the gun. Now, you're going to hear that the government got what's called a body warrant. A warrant that allowed them to search Brandon, to search his physical person, to search his body, to search what he was wearing, to search everything that was on him. And you're going to hear the government collected his clothing, but they never tested it. They never tested it for gunshot residue. You're going to hear that they specifically swabbed his hands. And they did that specifically. It's put there right on an evidence examination request form that they were swabbing the hands to test for gunshot residue. That testing never happened. Now, this gunshot residue testing, that's not the only thing where police collected evidence but didn't test it. You're going to hear about other things like that as the case proceeds. I'm not going to get into all of them right now. But I am going to ask that you pay careful attention throughout the trial to all the times where the police collected evidence that they should have tested, that they then just didn't bother to even test. And I'm going to ask that you consider that. Keep that in mind and think about that when you're deciding whether the government proved to you that Brandon did what they are accusing him of. There's another way that the government did not do a thorough investigation in this case. I want to talk to you for a moment about some of the evidence that the police didn't even bother collecting. You're going to hear that Brandon had a cell phone. And I don't know how much you all pay attention to how much data a phone truly generates and how much it really keeps track of you. But you're going to hear that there's a tremendous amount of data on a cell phone. One of the things a cell phone can track is your exact location with GPS, down to a couple of feet. It can track the number of steps someone has taken. It can track where they went throughout the day. It can track whether the person received calls or texts, whether there were plans for someone else to come over to the house. All of those kinds of useful bits of information would have been on Brandon's phone. But you're going to hear the police never took his phone. They never asked him for permission to search his phone. They never tried to get a warrant to search his phone. They didn't do anything with his phone whatsoever. Now, that's not the only piece of evidence that they should have collected, should have looked into, but didn't. It's not the only thing that they didn't collect that points to how much they were not thorough in their investigations. So I'm, again, going to ask that you pay attention to the other evidence you hear about the police not collecting, that they would have collected had they investigated properly. The other really important thing in this case to keep in mind as you're listening to all the evidence is that the police were only looking for evidence that pointed towards Brandon. Again, they jumped to that conclusion right off the bat, and they tried to find things that would back that up. You're going to hear the police did not go wherever the evidence would lead them. They specifically looked for evidence that would point to Brandon. And I want to talk to you about one very specific, very important example of that. And that's the gun. You know, the government just told you a few minutes ago that the gun was sent to the state lab and it was fingerprinted. And that's true. And when that happened, what did they find? Surprise, surprise, Brandon's fingerprints were on Brandon's gun. But I want to talk to you about some of the things the government didn't tell you about that gun and did not tell you about what happened at the state lab. Because you're going to hear that prior to that gun being tested for fingerprints, the lab was told to look for evidence that would link Brandon to the gun. You're going to hear that prior to testing that gun for fingerprints, 6 swabs, not 1, not 2, 6 different swabs were taken to test for what's called touch DNA. I want to explain that concept just briefly. We all have cells on our skin cells on our hands. When we touch something, we leave tiny, tiny microscopic amounts of our skin behind. And that tiny microscopic amount can be tested, can be collected and tested for DNA. It's called touch DNA. And you're going to hear that when a surface is textured, it's very hard to fingerprint, but it's more likely to leave behind touch DNA. Now, you're going to hear that the state lab collected, as I said, 6 swabs from the gun. Those were from the handle, those were from the trigger. Those 6 swabs would have had DNA from someone who touched the gun by the handle, not leaving fingerprints. Someone who touched the trigger, again, not leaving fingerprints. But the state lab was specifically told, look for evidence that connects the gun to Brandon Castiglione. And if you find it, do not do any more testing. Don't do it. We don't want to know. We don't want to run any tests that might connect the gun to someone other than Brandon. We don't want to do any tests that might connect the gun to the actual killer. No. The lab was told, don't run those tests. The police were only interested in evidence that pointed to Brandon. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear who gave that instruction to the state lab. The person who told the lab to look for evidence to link it to Brandon and told the lab, don't test those swabs that you took for touch DNA. That person, that was Trooper Stephen Slover, the lead investigator in this case. Now, you've heard that when the police first arrived, and just even minutes before that, when Brandon's sister and his grandmother went into the house and saw him, he was, you're going to hear it probably described a few different ways, but he was down on his knees. Some people have described it as being in a fetal position. And he was praying. You're going to hear that he was speaking in tongues. And you're going to hear that this is not uncommon for Brandon. You will hear that Brandon was, at the time, and is to this day, a deeply religious man. That he went to church regularly at the New England Pentecostal. That one of the things that people do there is speak in tongues. This is something that's part of his religious tradition. You're going to hear from multiple people that they had seen him do this frequently, many times, many different places. They'll tell you that when Brandon is in a state of deep prayer like that, he blocks everything out. He cannot be disturbed. People cannot get his attention. They'll tell you he can stay in that state for hours at a time. It's not surprising that when Brandon found Luis Garcia dead, that he started praying. Now, I want to talk to you about something else that the government mentioned a few minutes ago. And they said they don't have to prove motive. And that's technically true. They don't. But they're saying that, ladies and gentlemen, because they have absolutely no motive. There was no reason Brandon would have had to kill Luis Garcia. You're going to hear that they were on friendly terms, that they attended the same church, that they frequently went to Bible study together, that they hung out and socialized outside of church activities sometimes. You're not going to hear from a single person who says that they saw Brandon ever argue with Mr. Garcia, with Luis. You're not going to hear from anyone who says that Brandon ever threatened Luis. No, they were friends. When you've heard all the evidence, you will see that the government cannot prove its case. It can't prove its case because the police jumped to conclusions. It can't prove its case because the police did not do a thorough investigation. It can't prove its case because the police only looked for evidence that pointed to Brandon and ignored evidence that didn't. In the end, there is one very, very simple reason the government will not be able to prove its case. Brandon Castiglione did not shoot Luis Garcia. Brandon is not guilty.
Thank you, Counselor.
So the state calls Sergeant Andrew Phillips. If you'll remain standing and raise your right hand, I'll swear you in. You swear the testimony you'll give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury?
I do.
Okay, have a seat. And if you could just state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
Yep, it's Andrew Phillips, Phillips.
And how are you employed?
I'm currently a patrol sergeant with the Londonderry Police Department.
If you could just speak up so we can hear you all the way back here.
Yep, I'm a patrol sergeant with the Londonderry Police Department.
Appreciate it, thank you. And how long have you been a sergeant at Londonderry PD?
In that role, just about 6 months or so.
How long have you worked at Londonderry Police Department in total?
Going on 6 years, I believe.
Did you have any law enforcement experience before that?
I did, yes. I was employed by the Samberton Police Department in New Hampshire.
So, all in all, how long have you been an officer?
July 1 will be 10 years.
Did you graduate from Police Academy in New Hampshire?
I did, yes.
When was that?
December of 2013.
Can you tell us today what are some of your duties and responsibilities?
As a patrol sergeant, I just oversee an assigned shift that I'm assigned to, make sure officers are doing their duties they're supposed to, correct paperwork, just day-to-day operations of a shift.
In October of 2019, you were working at Londonderry Police Department, right?
Correct, yes.
What was your assignment at that time?
That time I was a field training officer.
Tell us about some of your duties and responsibilities then.
As an FTO, you're assigned to a newer officer that could be from another department or just newly hired officer. You're just there to train them, make sure they're ready to be a solo officer on their own.
Did you ever respond to calls for service?
I did, yes.
Can you kind of explain for the court what that means, a call for service?
So call for service, somebody calls 911 or just directed to the police department. It gets dispatched out to police officers in their cars, and then they respond to the address or wherever it may be, just to respond to the call that was given out.
If I could have just one moment, Your Honor. Did you investigate crimes at that time?
I did, yes.
Okay. Was that in-depth investigations or something else?
At that level, as just a police officer, as a regular patrol officer, and it's not an in-depth investigation, no. Just a cursory information.
I want to draw your attention to October 1st of 2019. Were you working that day?
I was, yes.
We're just turning on our technology. Bear with us. What shift were you working that day?
Second shift, which is 2 to 10:30 p.m.
At some point, did you become involved in the investigation of the shooting death of Luis Garcia?
I did, yes.
Tell us about that. How did you become involved?
At 2:28, there was a call given by dispatch for a welfare check at 15 Ridgemont Drive in Londonderry, and my trainee and I responded to that location for that call that was given out.
Okay. I want to go back to a couple of things you said in there. So a welfare check, what does that mean?
So welfare check, it could be a number of things. People call just concerned about whoever it is they're calling about. It could be minor things or serious calls for such as this one that we're talking about right now.
Okay. And you said you were going to a 15 Ridgemont Drive in Londonderry?
Correct, yes.
Is that a town in New Hampshire?
It is, yes.
What county is that in?
Rockingham County.
Did you become aware at some point during that day, maybe not initially, but whose house that was that you were going to?
I did, yes, I did after the fact.
Whose house was that?
It's the Castiglione residence owned by Mark Castiglione.
Did any other officers respond with you to 15 Ridgemont Drive?
Yes.
Who was that?
My trainee, Officer Cameron Verrier, and then Officer Matthew Morin responded as well.
Do you recall who arrived at the residence first?
Officer Morin arrived just moments before Officer Verrier and I did.
What was he doing when you arrived? Matt Morin, what was he doing?
Officer Morin, excuse me, he was in the driveway of 15 Ridgemont Drive speaking with the calling party, just gathering additional information so we knew what was going on.
Did you know who the calling party was at that time?
I know now, at the time I didn't, but it was a Danielle Castiglione.
Okay. Did she go by any other name?
Not that I am aware of.
Did you know her relationship to that residence?
I did not.
Were you given, like you said earlier, the welfare check, what was that regarding? Who were you being asked to check on?
So we didn't know who we were being asked to check on. It was initially just a welfare check, and then additional information came out from dispatch that there was, quote unquote, 2 people down inside of the residence.
After you arrived on scene, did you learn where the 2 people who were, quote unquote, down, did you learn where they were inside the residence?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And where were they discovered?
If you're looking at the front of the residence, it was the top left bedroom on the 2nd floor.
Okay. Who pointed out that room to you?
Officer Morin was speaking with Danielle Castiglione, and while she was speaking to him, she pointed to that room on the residence.
Did you go inside that residence?
Yes.
Before we get into what happened once you were inside, can you just describe the house for us a little bit?
It's a single-family home, split-level style home, so when you enter, you can either go up or down the stairs to the basement or to the 2nd floor, or the main floor, rather.
Okay, that main floor, what's the layout of that area?
At the top of the stairs, towards your right is the, excuse me, the living room and a kitchen area, and then down, there's a hallway to the left at the top of the stairs, which has a couple bedrooms and a bathroom.
Okay. What door did you go into the house through?
The front door.
Was that open at the time?
Yes.
So once you went inside, where did you go?
Once we were inside the residence, we went up the stairs to the main floor, and we took a left down that hallway that was described to us where the subjects were.
What did you observe in that hallway as you went down it?
As we were going down the hallway, I noticed that the bedroom that was described, the back left bedroom, the door was open, and also noticed a white, called a drawer organizer, but it's like a cabinet, white plastic cabinet in the hallway.
Did you notice anything of significance around that drawer?
On the top of the cabinet was a black semi-automatic Glock handgun.
What did you do when you observed that handgun?
I called it out to the other officers so they were aware of its presence there.
Did you observe anything about that gun, its make, its manufacturer, anything like that?
I noticed there was a Glock, which is the same type firearm we carry, so I recognized it that way.
Okay. Did you go inside that bedroom or the room that Danielle Castiglione had described to you?
Yes.
Was the door open to that room at the time?
Yes, the door was open.
What did you observe about the condition of that room?
It was being remodeled, and at least being painted. I know that. All the furniture in the room was pushed in towards the middle. And then there was a painter's tarp, or cloth, if you will, on the floor, consistent with obviously being painted.
Was there anyone inside that room?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us about that.
There was a subject who was later identified as Brandon Castiglione, was inside of the bedroom, just a couple feet from the doorway. He was on the floor. It's kind of hard to describe, but like a fetal type position on his hands and knees with his hands on his head on the ground. He was kind of trembling. And then there was another subject. I could only see his legs sticking out from behind a cabinet or a dresser that was in the middle of the room.
That first person you described, male in a fetal position, I think is how you put it, on his hands and knees. Do you see that person in the courtroom today?
I do, yes.
Could you point him out and describe a piece of clothing he's wearing?
He's wearing a white dress shirt.
The record reflect the witness has identified the defendant.
What do you think?
No objection.
Good job.
Was the defendant moving when you saw him there in that room?
Like I said, he was trembling. Just small movements, nothing of significance.
Did you hear him saying anything when you went inside?
He was mumbling. I couldn't make out what it was that he was saying.
Could you determine a general gist of what it was that he was doing there on the floor?
It was definitely odd, him being there. It was, as far as what he was doing on the floor, I don't know.
And I think you said that you saw someone else's legs in the room?
Correct, yes.
Did anyone, could you describe the position of those legs that you saw?
So like I said, they were sticking out from behind a dresser. I could tell by the orientation that the subject was on his back, and his legs were bent.
Did anyone check on that person?
Yes, Officer Morin did.
Was Officer Morin the first person to go in that room?
Yes.
And when you say checked on him, how did he do that?
Officer Morin walked around. The furniture was all pushed in towards the middle. I couldn't see him, but I heard him say that it appeared that the male was deceased.
Was that male laying on his back as you described it, was he ever identified?
Yes.
Who was that?
Luis Garcia.
At that point, or at any point, did you fully enter the room?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Where were you positioned inside the room?
I stayed behind Mr. Castiglione while Officer Morin checked on Mr. Garcia.
And that's behind the defendant?
Yes, correct, yes.
As you stood there, what did you observe from that position?
From that position, a few feet, or just a couple feet from the defendant's head, was a single shell casing on the floor.
You said earlier you had seen that black pistol, the Glock, outside in the hallway. How close to the defendant would you estimate that handgun was?
Several feet. It wasn't far at all, 5, 6 feet. I don't know exactly, but that'd be my guess.
You said earlier that you recognized it as a Glock.
Correct.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Showing you what's marked for identification as States 4. Do you recognize this photograph?
I do, yes.
And what is in this photograph?
This is the cabinet that I described with the handgun on top of it.
Is this photograph a fair and accurate representation of how that handgun in that hallway appeared on the day you went into 15 Ridgemont Drive?
It is, yes.
Move to strike the ID and enter as a full exhibit.
No objection.
Okay, it's a full exhibit. You may publish it to the jury if you wish.
So I'll draw your attention to the monitor here. We're looking at a slide of States 4. If you don't mind, Judge, could I have the witness step down?
Go right ahead, sure.
If you could step down, we'll approach the monitor.
Can the jurors all see that okay? Is there a glare? Sometimes there's a glare with these lights. Okay.
And if you could just point out where in that photograph the handgun that you observed is depicted.
Right here on top of the cabinet right here.
Does that red circle now, does that accurately reflect where that handgun is?
Yes.
Okay. And you can step back up to the stand. Thank you. Apologize, the monitor is so far away. But... Oh, relative to where that handgun is, where was the room where you found the defendant?
The room, you can see it in the left portion of the picture, the doorway. That is the room that the defendant was in.
Does that green oval reflect where that doorway was?
Yes.
May I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Showing you now what's marked for identification as States 26. Do you recognize this photograph?
Yes.
Okay, and what's in this photograph?
This is the top of the cabinet with the handgun.
Is this a fair and accurate representation of the handgun as you observed it on that day, October 1st, 2019?
Yes.
Move to strike the ID and enter as full exhibit.
No objection.
Okay, full exhibit. May publish to the jury.
Showing you a slide of States 26. And again, just to go back, how close to the defendant was that handgun in your best estimation?
Just several feet, 5, 6 feet.
So you mentioned earlier, standing in that doorway, you had made another observation inside the room.
Correct.
What was that?
There was a single shell casing just a couple feet from the top of the defendant's head.
Okay. Can you kind of describe for us just briefly what a shell casing is?
So shell it's the portion of the bullet when you fired from a gun is ejected out the side, and the projectile, the actual bullet, continues out the barrel.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Showing you what's marked for identification as States 109. Do you recognize this?
I do, yes.
And what is this photo of?
It's a photo of the bedroom with all the furniture pushed in, the shell casing, the painter's cloth, and the decedent.
Is this a fair and accurate representation of that last bedroom on the left that you entered on October 1st, 2019?
Yes.
Move to strike the ID and enter as a full exhibit, Judge.
Any objection?
May I just see?
I'm sorry, counsel, what was the number on that one?
109.
109?
And I apologize, Judge. Was there an objection?
There was not an objection.
Okay, it's admitted.
Thank you. I'm showing you now a slide of States 109. Does that photo, I believe you said it already, but does that photo show the casing that you observed as you stood in that room?
Excuse me. Yes, it does.
Okay, and once more, I'll ask you to step down if you could, and it's small in the photograph, so if you could point it out for us.
Before that happens, can we just approach briefly, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
So if you would, you could step down. And then in this photograph, if you could just point out where that casing was that you saw.
Right there on the floor.
Does that red circle accurately depict where it was located?
Yes, it does.
You can have another seat. Although the exact spot may not be depicted in that photograph, if you could just kind of describe generally where the defendant was located when you found him in that room.
He would have been towards the bottom portion of the photo with his head oriented towards the defendant and his feet back towards the wall, down in that position that I described.
Okay, I apologize. I think you said that his head was oriented towards the defendant. Did you
I'm
mean
sorry, the
something else?
decedent. I apologize.
Okay, so he was, his head was oriented towards Luis Garcia?
Yes, correct.
Okay. After observing everything that you've described for us, the Glock on the set of drawers outside the room, the defendant on his hands and knees trembling, that shell casing, and Luis Garcia apparently dead inside the room, what was done after that?
I placed Mr. Castiglione into handcuffs, just pending investigation to detain him.
What was done with the defendant after that?
He was stood up and escorted out of the residence by Officer Morin.
What did you do after that point?
Officer Verrier and I just maintained security of the room, pending full investigation by other officers.
Okay. Did you have any other involvement in this case?
We maintained security outside of the residence afterwards. That's about it.
One moment, Your Honor. Nothing further, Judge.
Cross-examination?
May we approach one more time?
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
Can he have his notes in there? Thank you. Yes.
No, it's fine. These I can keep in my office, and I can't have to go in my office. That has to be locked up every day. Okay. So I would just, and I have to go down and get it, see, somebody, a monitor has to receive it. Nobody in the office can.
Okay.
So, and if I'm in here, I can have one of the other.
case there's something I missed, to make sure that they don't capture any of the conversations between counsel. Every now and then when the camera pans over there, it's looking at the big screen. There are occasional shots of just from his chest up during the openings and during the openings, but nothing that expresses any kind of content. So I'm watching for that. A lot of times when the camera's pointed over there, it's actually not even active. They're using the cameras in the back to catch the witness testimony. So the fact that it's kind of sitting over there, it's not even active. So I'll be monitoring it for it, so the deputy clerk be monitoring for it. And if I see anything that record that's the thing that I have in place to monitor compliance, so you know.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, all right, are we ready to proceed?
Yes.
All right, thank you. We might be a little premature, they're not lined up.
They're on the way. All rise for the jury, please. You may be seated.
Counsel?
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you today?
I'm well, how are you?
Good, thank you. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk to you about some of the things that you talked about on your direct, okay?
Sure.
And can you hear me okay? Because I feel like you're very far away
Yes,
from
I
me.
can, yeah.
Okay. So you talked about getting information from dispatch about a welfare call, is that right?
Correct, yes.
And that was on October 1st, 2019?
Correct,
Around 2:28 in the afternoon?
yes.
You were working Sector 3?
Yes,
What's Sector 3?
that's the southern portion of Londonderry.
Okay, so were you pretty close to the home you were being dispatched to?
It's not, we could have been closer, we're still several miles away. It's a larger area to cover, but,
Okay.
yep.
Is it fair to say it took about 10 minutes to get there?
Correct, yes.
You testified on direct that you were an FTO,
Yes,
Field Training Officer?
correct, yep.
And you were training Officer Verrier, is that correct?
Yes.
How long had he been a police officer at that point?
Oh, I don't want to take a guess. I know he had worked at another agency before that, but I don't want to guess how many years he has had on.
Okay, that's fair. Were you two in the same cruiser?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know how long he had been with the department at that point?
I would say just several weeks.
You testified that Officer Morin got there slightly before the two of you.
Correct, yep.
Is moments sort of a fair statement to make?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I mean, you got there within a minute or two.
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember, and I know it was a few years ago, but do you remember what you were wearing that day?
Just full police uniform.
Okay, how about footwear?
Boots. I've had several pairs since, but
Okay, are there standard issue boots or
No.
are they your own?
you buy your own.
Okay. How about gloves? Were you wearing gloves that day?
Normally when we go to calls, we put on gloves. If I did or not, I don't want to take a guess.
Okay. Do you know if either Officer Morin or Officer Verrier were wearing gloves?
I believe Officer Verrier was, because we've had this discussion.
So the information you had when you were going into the house was that there wasn't a person or persons down,
Correct.
and that there was blood around one of the people.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Those were essentially the only specifics you had at that point.
Yes.
And so the goal at that initial point was to go in and render aid if you could. Is that
Correct.
correct?
Yep.
Okay. And so the order of, I guess, the three of you going into the home, I just want to make sure I have it right. It's Officer Morin,
Correct.
and then you and Officer Verrier, or is it sort of a single file thing?
It was single file.
Okay. Do you remember which order you were in
I
that?
believe I was in the middle.
Okay. And then there's a stairway that goes up to the main living,
Yes.
and then the stairway also goes down to additional living. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And you were all heading to the bedroom at the top floor end of the house on the left?
Correct.
Okay. Were you checking the rooms as you went to make sure no one else was there?
No, because we had information there in that room, and that door was open.
Okay. And so the only information you had was that there were two people there?
Yes. Yeah.
So no need or feeling of emergency for anyone else being in the house? Is that your testimony?
Our initial objective was just to get to those two people in that room, and that's obviously we discovered that, and everything changed. So.
Okay. Do you remember what the carpet was like on the way to the end of the hallway?
I don't. I'm sorry.
So when you got to the bedroom, what you testified to was that Brandon was essentially in the threshold, but right inside the doorway. Is that fair?
Yes.
And there was a bunch of furniture in the center of the room.
Correct.
Furniture was covered with tarps,
No.
drop cloths,
I don't recall if the furniture. I know the floor was.
but you don't remember where the drop cloths were with respect to the furniture.
I don't. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's okay. And you could see legs sticking out from the dresser.
Correct.
So at some point, Officer Morin decided to sort of take the lead in terms of seeing what was going on with Mr. Garcia. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
He couldn't see what was going on, so he tried to move the drop cloths. Is that right?
I don't know if he moved anything. I don't know.
You didn't see him move the drop cloth?
Not that I recall right now. No.
Okay. And when he walked around to get a better look about what was going on, was that about the same time you saw the plastic organizer with the gun on it?
No, I saw that prior to us going into the room.
Okay, so right off the bat you saw the gun?
Yes.
And you announced that there was a gun there?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Did you notice specifically any specific placement or positioning of the gun?
Just that it was on top of the dresser or whatever cabinet.
Okay. And while all of this is going on, and let me sort of back up a little bit, this was an occurrence that happened very quickly. Is that fair to say?
What do you just? Can you rephrase that? I guess.
I can, absolutely. The moments that you go into the bedroom to when Brandon is taken out of the room. It was a very quick occurrence. Is that correct?
Quick. I wouldn't say quick. It wasn't hasty. We took our time. We were methodical about it. It wasn't rushed, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
So you have radios to call in what you're doing
Yes.
to the station or to dispatch?
Correct.
Okay. So if dispatch recorded that you were there at 14:37.
Correct.
Which would be 2:37.
Yep.
Almost 2:38 because it's actually 14:37 and 53 seconds.
Okay.
Okay. And then dispatch would have been notified when Brandon was taken into custody. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so advising dispatch that one subject is detained is the taking into
Yes,
custody.
it is.
And so if that happened at 14:40 or 2:40, and you got there at almost 2:38, that's a pretty quick period of time, right?
Sure, you could say
A
that.
couple minutes. Okay. So you didn't initially see the shell casing, right?
When I saw it, I don't recall. I mean, I did see it. In what order, I don't know.
But you saw it somewhere inside the room beyond where Brandon was.
Correct.
Okay. So when the decision was made to detain Brandon, you put the handcuffs on him.
I did, yes.
Officer Morin helped him stand up.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. And while that was going on, he was crying.
He was mumbling. I don't know what he was saying. Crying, I don't recall.
Okay. Could have been.
I don't recall.
So as Officer Morin was escorting Brandon out of the room, he told you and Officer Verrier to stay in the room and conduct room security or
Correct.
scene
yeah.
security.
Yes.
Scene security is making sure that no one else comes in,
Correct.
no one else, destroys any evidence,
Correct.
alters anything.
Yep, correct.
And while you were waiting with Officer Verrier, he actually picked the gun up, right?
That was prior to us actually going into the room.
Okay. So before you even went into the room, he picked the gun up.
Correct.
Okay. He took the magazine out,
He did.
he put the magazine back in,
Yes.
and put the gun down.
Yes.
And because you were in such a sort of an emergency mode to render aid if you could, there was no documenting of where the gun was before that happened.
It was on top of the dresser, and he picked it up and it went back on top of the dresser. So it's orientation, I don't know, but
Okay. So you don't know about orientation, and the dresser obviously is bigger than the size of the gun.
correct.
Okay. The other thing that I think you testified that you did was a log of who was coming into the room.
I believe Officer Verrier did that.
Okay, but you were with Officer Verrier, right?
Correct, yes.
Okay, so you have an idea of who came into the room.
Yeah, we were relieved fairly quickly from the room and then moved outside the residence.
Okay, so when you're keeping a log of who's going into the room, or when he's keeping a log of who's going into the room, that suggests that other people went into the room, right?
Either the room or the residence. I don't know if, I want to clarify, I don't know if the log was for just the entire residence or the specific bedroom where Mr. Garcia was.
So you didn't note the difference between the two?
Since Officer Verrier did the log, I don't know.
While you were at the residence doing scene security, there were several officers coming and going, correct?
Correct, yes.
We've already talked about Officer Moore and Officer Verrier. You,
Correct.
Officer Alfaro,
I believe he did show up, yes.
Detective Narciso Garcia,
Yes.
Detective Archambault,
Yes.
Detective Halleck,
Yes.
Lieutenant Tufo,
Yes.
Sergeant Hurley,
Yes.
Detective Tufo.
I believe so, yes.
All of those individuals were going into the home, correct?
I don't know if they were going, I know they were on scene. What they did, I don't know.
Well, you were doing scene security, right?
Correct.
So you would know if they were going into the home or not.
From 4 years later, I don't recall exactly what they were doing.
Okay, so let's talk about security logs. You keep those security logs so that there is documentation about who is coming and going from the house, right?
Correct.
And to make sure that only essential people are going to and from the house.
Correct.
Because again, some of the issues is you don't want to damage any evidence that is potentially within the house.
Correct.
Okay, and so you're saying you don't remember and you don't have a security log for people coming into the residence?
I don't. Officer Verrier did that.
Okay, you're certain he did that?
I believe he did.
Okay. the one other thing I want to talk to you about, at least in this instance, I do have a couple more things, I'm sorry. You were actually working pretty late that night, right?
Correct, yes.
What did you say your shift was?
It's 2 to 10:30 p.m.
Okay, and so you were there well after 10:30.
Correct, yes.
Okay. One of the things that you did, that you did not talk about on direct, was that you actually went back to the police department when Brandon was served the body warrant. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you participate in that body warrant?
I was just in the booking room while I believe the state police did that.
Okay. Were you watching?
I was just in the area. I don't know if I was watching or not.
Okay. Did you notice when Brandon was taken out of the room what he was wearing on his feet?
No, I don't.
Okay, so you don't remember if he had shoes on or not?
I don't.
Okay. I just want to talk to you briefly about the pictures that the state showed you, if I may. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
So I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 109, 26, and 4. So you testified that these are accurate pictures from what you saw on October 1st. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Did you take these pictures?
No.
When were these pictures taken?
I do not know.
Okay. So you don't know where they came from?
Well, they came from the residence. I just don't know who took them.
Sorry. Better question. You don't know who took them?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Okay. And are you recalling specifically this glass shelf when you saw the room?
I don't recall exactly. I can't give you a definitive answer on that.
Okay. So you don't know if this is a fair and accurate depiction of the room when you were there?
It is. I just don't know that shelf. It was moved. I have no idea. But
Okay. And when you say the shelving was moved, are we
we're
talking?
talking the pane of glass there. Apologize.
The pane of glass?
Yep.
Okay. Do you know where it was moved from?
I don't know.
Okay. I have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes, you may.
I just have two more questions. Do you know who the officer in charge was for the Londonderry Police Department during this investigation?
The patrol supervisor was Sergeant McCutcheon. As far as the investigation, I don't know who was in charge of that.
And how about, do you know when major crimes got to 15 Ridgemont?
No, I don't have the time.
Okay. And do you know who was leading that investigation?
I don't.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Any redirect?
Just a few questions, Your Honor. So defense counsel asked you a few questions about a security log that was being kept. Who did you say was keeping that?
Officer Verrier.
And do you know that for a fact, or is that best of your knowledge?
I believe based on reading reports, it was indicated Officer Verrier was the one that did that.
Okay. We went through on direct and then on cross about how you were his field training officer that day, is that right?
Correct, yes.
Okay, but were you assigning him that task?
I did not. I believe one of the detectives did.
Were you involved in the log keeping at all that day?
No.
Do you know where Officer Verrier was when he was apparently keeping this log?
I believe we were outside of the residence, but to be certain, I don't.
When you say outside of the residence, was it at the front door?
The front door, yes.
Okay. And then also on cross, so defense counsel went through a little bit about the timing of things from when you first went in that room and then when the defendant was taken out of the house. And it was about 2 minutes, is that about right?
Correct.
Okay. So looking at the court's clock here, it's reading 3:10:50. Let's go through 2 minutes. So at 3:11, we'll start. Now. So the clock now reads 3:13. That was 2 minutes?
Correct.
Okay. Is that what you meant, I think on cross when you said that your actions inside that room were not rushed?
Correct, yes.
And that you and the 2 other officers in there were methodical?
Yes.
One moment, Your Honor. Nothing further.
Anything based on that?
Just briefly, Your Honor.
Okay. I'll give you 2 minutes.
I'll take it. So I just want to clarify a few things. When you talked about being outside the door and being with Officer Verrier, you were in fact training him, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so you were with him as this is all going on.
When we were inside the room, yes.
And when you were outside standing at the door with him?
When we were outside the residence,
Mm-hmm.
I was being pulled in other directions as well, so I wasn't with him the entire time.
So what you had testified to is you were doing outdoor scene security, and my understanding it was with Officer Verrier. That's not what you were doing?
It is, but I wasn't with him the entire time.
We just sat here for 10 minutes in silence, right? Or 2 minutes in silence.
Correct,
Sorry, it
yes.
felt like 10 minutes to me. But 2 minutes in silence.
Yes.
Okay. You obviously were not sitting and reflecting in the 2 minutes that you were trying to render emergency aid to an individual on October 1st, 2019. Is that right?
Correct.
It was a situation where you were all working together to try to figure out what was going on. Is that correct?
Yes.
And there were some moving parts, and it was not a time where you were sitting around looking at the clock.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
You may sit down. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your Honor, may this witness be released?
I have no objection.
Okay. Thank you, sir. You may be excused.
Your Honor, at this time, the state calls Mrs. Frances Pastana. Pistani, can you hear me okay from up there?
Just a little,
Okay. Do you need to speak up a little bit louder?
please.
You got it. If at any point in time you can't hear me, just let me know, or I can move closer if that helps as well.
Okay.
I believe previously you had indicated you might have a little bit of a blockage in one of your
And
ears.
this here.
A little bit more to this side then. So, if you would please, actually for a moment.
Counsel, you want to swear the witness?
I'm about to say, Your Honor, I was going to swear the witness. And
All right, sorry.
I was going to ask Your Honor if it was all right if she remained sitting at this time.
She may, yes.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Pistano, if you would please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you will give this jury will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you very much. Would you please state your full name and spell both your first and your last name for the record since we're being recorded?
Okay, it's Frances Pestana, Frances. Pestana is P is in Paul, Estana.
Mrs. Pistano, where do you live? What town do you live in?
Derry, New Hampshire,
Okay. Where's your address in Derry?
10 Derryfield Road,
How long have you been living there?
35 years.
35 years. Okay. Are you married right now?
Yes.
Okay. What's your husband's name?
Jeffrey,
How long have you been married to Jeffrey?
35 years.
How many children do you have between the two of you?
7.
7. And how many grandchildren?
Grandchildren, I think 7, I can't remember.
Okay.
And I got quite a few great-grandkids,
Okay. Let me ask you, are you retired now?
yes.
Okay. At one point, what were some of the different types of jobs that you've held before you were retired?
I worked for Western Electric, AT&T, and Lucent. And then when they closed, I worked part-time 16 years at Macy's in Manchester.
Okay. Brandon Castiglione is one of your grandchildren, correct?
Yes.
Right. And who is his father?
Mark Castiglione,
What town do they live in?
Londonderry.
And the address in Londonderry, do you remember the street address?
I think it's 15 Ridgemont Drive.
Okay. About how far away is Mark's house from your house? If we were to get in a car and drive there together, about how long would it take you?
10, 15 minutes, no, something like that.
Okay. And does Brandon have any sisters?
Yes.
Okay, who's that?
Danielle.
Now, does she live in New Hampshire as well, or does she live somewhere else?
She lives in Mass.
In Mass? Okay. In October of 2019, was Brandon living at the house with his father on Ridgemont Drive?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to talk about somebody else for a few minutes. And I'd like to talk about Luis Garcia. How did you first meet Luis Garcia?
At NEP Church in Pelham.
Okay. And who was he married to?
Patty.
Patty? And let me ask you, would you call him Luis? Would you call him Garcia? What would you call him? I want to make
I
sure
used
I'm
to
using your
call him
term.
Garcia. I used to call him Garcia.
You used to just call him Garcia. All right. Then for today, I'm going to call him Garcia then as well. I want to make sure I'm using your words, okay?
Okay.
All right. You said you went at New England Pentecostal in Pelham. That's where you met?
Yes.
Okay. Did you become friends with Mr. and Mrs. Garcia?
Yes.
Okay. And at any point in time, were they living at your house?
Yes.
Okay. When was that?
To be honest with you, I don't remember.
Okay.
I really don't.
If we could kind of put a time frame on that, would it be months before this all happened or years before this all
Oh,
happened?
they lived with us for several months because they had no place to live, so we invited them to stay at our house. And everything was good.
Okay. How long had you been going to New England Pentecostal before this all happened?
Maybe 10 years.
10 years. Okay. And other than meeting the Garcias through the church, what were some of the activities that you would do together with them?
I was the greeter at the church, and he was a minister. He did odds and ends at the church, painting and stuff like that, helping out. And
With that, what are some of the different type of services or functions that you would go together to the church to have?
oh, they had like ceremony type things. I can't remember them offhand, but they would have like a Hawaiian thing, and we all get together and we had pictures taken, and a lot of the people from the church, we all get together in the gymnasium and stuff like that. They always had picnics and stuff like that.
What were some of the different services that you attended at that church? I imagine you went to fellowship on Sunday, but were there other services that you would attend to, or other study sessions? Or?
Yeah, there was Bible studies on Tuesday nights, and prayers on, I think it was Monday and Wednesday nights and stuff like that.
All right, so Bible study Tuesday nights, prayers Mondays and Wednesday nights.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Right.
Okay. And in addition to the Bible studies through the church, would you sometimes get together with the Garcias?
Yes, we go to their house on Thursday, I think it was Thursday nights, to do Bible study.
Okay. Would they ever come over to your house?
At that time, to be honest, I don't know. I can't remember.
Okay.
I know we did it a lot at their house in Manchester when they moved out.
I'd like to be specific about some of the other service things that you did, and I want to ask you about your involvement in those with Brandon. Did you do any sort of service down for nursing homes in Massachusetts?
Every Monday we would go to, with Brandon, to the nursing home and with Mother Mackenzie and other ministers to talk to the elderly and and pray with them and stuff like that.
Okay. And so Brandon would go with you?
Yes, so we'd pick him up. Jeff and I would pick him up every Monday and take him with us.
Every Monday. How did you learn that Garcia was going to be doing some work over at Mark's house?
Mark needed some painting done, I guess, and Garcia did that on the side for extra money.
Okay.
So he did painting there.
Did you ever go over to Mark's house to see the work that Garcia was doing?
Not right away, no.
Eventually?
Eventually, yeah.
What floor was he working on in the house?
Well, it's a split level, so it was on the second floor.
The second floor? Okay. And how long has Mark lived in that house? Do you know? Or maybe let me strike that question and rephrase it a different way. How many different years have you been going over to that house for family events, graduations, things like that?
Oh, a long time,
Long time.
yeah.
Okay. So you know the layout fairly well?
Yes,
The second
yeah.
floor, and then
Yeah.
down in the basement?
Yeah.
And before, well, when did you last see Brandon before that Tuesday afternoon, October 1st? When was the last time you saw Brandon before that day?
I'm assuming Monday, because we picked him up to go to, we used to go every Monday to the nursing home in Lowell.
I want to talk with you for a couple of minutes now about that Tuesday morning and what led to that Tuesday afternoon on October 1st, 2019. At some point that day, did you get a call from your granddaughter, Danielle?
Yes.
And without going into exactly what she told you, what did you try to do after you hung up the phone with her?
I think I had my husband with me. I can't remember, but he had fallen down the stairs prior to that, and he hurt his shoulder. So he came with me to check on, to see where Garcia and Brandon were.
Okay.
We got to the house. excuse me. And I rang the doorbell and went to the front. It was locked. So I went around the back. Nothing. Everything was locked up. And I called Danielle.
Okay. So I want to kind of backtrack for a little bit. So you got a call from Danielle after you hung up with her. And when you say he hit her shoulder, I imagine that he is your husband.
Yes.
Right, Jeff?
I'm sorry, yeah.
That's okay. And so you said you both went over. Which house did you go to again?
Mark's house.
Mark's house. And couldn't get inside at all?
No. Doors were locked.
Who were some of the people that you tried to call on the phone to find out what was going on?
I had called Patty, and I asked Patty, have you heard from Garcia? And she says, no, sometimes he shuts the phone off or whatever when he's painting and he's busy, so he doesn't answer the phone.
When you called Garcia, or when you had called him in the past, would he typically pick up the phone?
Oh, I wouldn't call him when he was working, so no.
Okay.
No.
All right. So you said that you talked with Patty.
Patty.
So you called Patty that day after you got the
Yes.
call from Danielle?
Yeah.
All right. So when you went over to the house and you couldn't get inside, you said the doors were locked, who did you call then?
I called Danielle back,
Okay.
and I says, no, nobody's answering. She says, I'll be right over, wait for me. And I says, well, I can't wait right now because my husband was hurting, so I brought him back home. And then I came back, and I pulled in, and then she came from behind me.
She came behind you, okay.
Excuse
And
me.
there should be some water right there. if
Yeah,
you
I
need
got it
or-
right here.
Okay. So she came behind you. You came right up the driveway?
Garcia's car was there, and then my car and Danielle's.
Garcia's car, your car, and you said Danielle's. Did Danielle have anybody with her in her car?
She had her 3 babies.
Okay. And how young are we talking about here?
3 years ago. Hey. I
I
can't
was thinking
remember.
about car seats. Are we thinking about car seats that face the
Oh,
back or the
yeah,
front?
car seats, yeah. I think Natalie is 7, so she was like 5, 6, 5, but they were little. They were babies.
When you and Danielle were there, what did Danielle try to do to get attention? Try to get inside or
She tried to get in, and then I think she called her dad to find out where the key was, but she tried ringing the doorbell, knocking on it like I did, and then she went around the back, and they were both still locked, and we walked a little bit to the front, and you could see there was a light on in one of the bedrooms, and she had pebbles or something she was throwing at the window to see if they would, nothing.
Still no response?
The stove, still no response, no.
Now, when you saw her doing that, where were you?
I was in the driveway watching her kids, because,
Cars?
yeah.
Okay. If I could approach from-
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, what are you showing me?
My understanding with no objection that these are going to be full exhibits. Specifically, exhibits number 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, and 15. So that's 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, and 15.
No objection. That's correct. Okay, they're admitted, thank you. May be displayed to the jury.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mrs. Pistana, I'm going to show you a couple of different exhibits. and then I'll put them up on the big screen and ask you a few more questions, okay?
All right.
All right. These are all pictures. I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 9. Do you recognize that driveway?
Yeah, that's Mark's driveway.
Okay. And I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 10. Whose house is that?
Mark's.
Okay. And State's Exhibit 11, kind of looking up a front walkway, would you agree? Mm-hmm. All right. Whose house is that?
Mark's house.
State's Exhibit 12.
Mark's house.
Okay. Is that the front door or the back door?
That's the front door.
State's Exhibit 14. Is this the side of the
The
same
side
house?
of the house, yeah.
Okay. And a moment ago, you said that there was a light on in one of the windows that Danielle was throwing
Yeah.
something, I think you said pebbles at.
Yeah,
Okay. Can you see that window there?
right here. Yeah.
All right. We'll put that on the screen in just a moment. And exhibit number 15, which part of the house is this?
That's the back side of the house.
That's the back side.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave these here.
Okay.
I'll put it up on the big screen, but I'm going to leave these here in case you need to get closer for more detail.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and put on the screen first State's Exhibit 9 that we looked at. Excuse me. Apologize. State's Exhibit 10. We just looked at this a moment ago. You said this is the front of Mark's house, is that
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Okay. And just so we're kind of orientating ourselves, the driveway for that house, is that over on the right-hand side
Right
of the
side,
picture?
yeah, yeah.
Right-hand side? Okay. Now going to State's Exhibit 9. This is the driveway?
The driveway.
Okay. And you said that you parked your car when you came in. You said there was Garcia's car, Danielle's car, and yours. Were you just kind of lined up in a row going down the driveway, or were you side by
Yeah,
side?
no. Coming down.
Up and down?
Yeah.
Okay. Now going to State's Exhibit 11. Again, is this the walkway to the front of the house, I believe you said?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Those bushes, about how high are those bushes?
They're high.
They're high?
I'm short, but they're high.
All right. And then leading to State's Exhibit, State's Exhibit 14. This is the left side of the house that you talked about?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
You pointed to the window, and I'm going to go ahead and stand up here for you. You pointed to the window a moment ago. There was a left and the right window one. You said there was I can see you're pointing with your finger to the right. This one here?
Yeah.
That's the window
That's,
that
yeah, because it was facing the house, the front of the house.
Okay. The one that Danielle was throwing pebbles at.
Yeah.
Now moving along to State's Exhibit 12. Is this the front door that you had knocked on?
Yes.
I see on here on this particular door, let me approach you with that a bit closer. On the front of that door in the center, is that a knocker?
Yes,
that's
it
there?
is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there any other way to, besides knocking or using the knocker, is there anything else that you can use to get somebody's attention?
The doorbell,
Okay.
but I didn't use the knocker, it's too high up, so I banged on the door.
You banged on the door, okay. Did you try the doorbell at
Yeah,
all? Everybody's doorbell is a little bit different. I know the one in my house is blaringly loud. When you rang that doorbell, could you hear it ringing while you were standing outside?
To be honest with you, I don't remember.
Okay.
I don't remember.
And then showing you State's Exhibit 15. Is this the back of the house?
Back of the house.
You stated that you would try to get in through the back door. How do we get through the back door? How do we get to
Going
that
up
door?
those stairs.
The stairs on the left-hand side?
Right, and I tried to open up the door, but that door was locked.
Locked. So at this point, had your phone calls to Garcia, had he picked up at all? Did he answer the phone at all?
No.
Okay. And I believe you were talking a little bit before, you said that Danielle had called somebody and then was able to find a key. Do you know who she
Her
called?
dad, she called her dad.
She called her dad?
Yeah.
Did you see where she got the key from?
I wasn't looking, I was paying attention to the kids in the car.
Okay. And at that point, who went inside once she got the key?
She went in first,
Okay. And where did you stay?
in the driveway with the kids.
When Danielle first went inside, how was she acting? What was her, like, we would call it the tone or the demeanor of her voice? What did she sound like to you?
She came out horrified. And she ran by me, and I said to her, "What's the matter? What's going on?" And she just, shook her. I mean, she was shaking. So when she came out,
And who did you call then?
who did
Judge,
I
I'm
call?
leaving.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
It's background of evidence. So,
Thank you.
next question.
When she came out of the house, was there a phone call that was made by anybody?
She called.
Who did she call?
I think it was 911. But to be honest with you, I can't remember.
Okay. Do you know if at some point 911 was called? Police came?
Yeah.
Okay. You said she came out, or go ahead.
She came, I remember her coming out, being frantic, and she was trying to dial 911. So when I saw the look on her face, I ran in the house. I wanted to see what was wrong.
You said before it's a split level house, is
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you first came through the door, where did you go? I see your hands pointed
Up.
up, is that right?
Yeah.
Your Honor, I understand with no objection that these can be made a full exhibit, State's Exhibit 2 and State's Exhibit 3.
Okay, you're admitted, maybe show them the jury.
So Mrs. Castiglione, when you go inside showing this jury State's Exhibit 2, are these the stairs that you go up?
Yes.
And which way do you turn when you get to the top of those stairs?
I remember getting to the top of the step, and I was yelling, "Brandon Garcia, where are you?" Can I take a cough thing?
Go right ahead.
I have a couple more if you need them. Cough drop?
Oh, I just took one, thank
okay,
you.
all right.
Thank you.
Take your time, we've got to do some administrative things anyway. Your Honor, it's my understanding with the defendant's agreement that State's Exhibit 24 would have ID stricken vehicle.
I'm sorry, I believe it's 74.
I'm sorry, 74.
74.
All right, 74.
Okay, 74, full exhibit.
When you got to the top of the stairs, did you turn to your right and look there?
I stood at the top of the steps, and I turned to the right because it's like a little living room.
So let me show you State's Exhibit 74.
Yeah, that room, yeah.
That's the room?
I turned and I yelled again, "Garcia, Brandon, where are you?" Then I looked in the kitchen, which was straight ahead.
Okay. And I'm going back to State's Exhibit 2. When you say straight ahead, is that the room
That's,
at the top?
go
of the
straight
room?
up, yeah. Go into the room.
Was there anybody in that room?
No, there was nobody there.
So then when you turn to your left, I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 3.
That hall, right. I
That's the hall.
walked down that hall yelling again, "Garcia, Brandon, where are you? Is everything okay?"
And
And I got to the end, and Brandon was right at the door in a fetal position, going back and forth, going back and forth. And I said, Brandon, you okay? I tapped him on the back. Brandon, what's up? You okay? He didn't answer. He just kept going back and forth.
Could you hear? Were there any noises?
Nothing. No noises.
Have you ever seen him like that before?
No.
What happened next?
So when he was in the fetal position going back and forth, I kept saying, Brandon, you okay? And I said, where's Garcia? And the minute I said that, they had furniture in the middle of the room, because Garcia, I was assuming, was painting in that room.
Okay.
I saw one leg up, and I walked around
Around what or who?
the furniture. And he was leaning on his back. And there was blood everywhere. And I went, oh my God. So I stepped over him and I ran down the hall, ran outside. And I think I called my husband and I said, he's gone, he's gone.
When you got outside, did you stay with Danielle and the kids or did you go somewhere else?
No, I stayed right there.
And did the officers come pretty quickly after that?
The officer came up to me and he says,
Well, hold on, ma'am.
Oh,
I
all
want
right.
to go on to what he says.
okay.
I just want to stick with what you saw and you said. I'm sorry.
I was all upset.
When you were in the house, did you see anybody else in there?
No.
At some point, did you see Brandon Castiglione come out of the house with the police officer?
Yeah.
Did he say anything to you?
No.
Just a moment, please. Mrs. Pistana, I'm sorry, I've just got two more questions for you. I apologize. You said that when you went into the room and you went around and you saw Mr. Garcia, you stepped over something or someone.
I stepped over Brandon.
He was still there in the middle of the room.
Yeah.
Is Brandon in the courtroom today?
Yeah.
You point out where he's sitting. What he's
He's
doing.
sitting right there.
Thank you, ma'am. Your Honor, the record please reflect that the witness has identified the defendant.
No objection.
Okay.
Good job.
Thank you. Mrs. Pistana, thank you very much for answering my questions. I don't have any further ones right now. I believe defense counsel will have a few questions for you.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Are you okay to go forward, or do you need a moment?
No, I'm okay.
Okay. I do have a few questions for you. You spoke to the police that very day, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And back when you talked to the police, it's been over 4 years since that day, correct?
Yeah.
Fair to say that your memory of what happened was better back that day when you talked to him, the very day this happened, than it is here today?
No, some of the things I remember.
And I understand that you remember some things. I'm not saying you don't remember things. But would your memory have been fresher back then?
Yeah.
And you were being honest when you talked to the police back then. Mm-hmm. You were telling them what you knew. I'm sorry, you have to answer out loud. I see you
Oh,
nodding
I'm
your
sorry,
head.
yes,
That's okay. You were telling them what you heard,
yes,
and what you saw,
yes,
and what you knew.
yes,
You were telling them the truth.
yes,
You were telling them all of that to the best of your ability.
yes.
Okay. Now, what you actually told the police that very day was that when you went into the house, you saw that Brandon was praying. Isn't that right?
Praying
Praying.
in a fetal position like this, but
Yes.
not saying anything.
Okay. You had seen him pray in a position like that before, correct?
In church,
Okay. So you'd seen him do that in church.
yes,
Okay. And you actually told the police that he was speaking in tongues.
I don't remember that.
Okay.
I don't,
No, that's okay. I happen to have a transcript of
Okay,
that interview
yeah,
with
yeah.
the police. If I showed you a portion of that transcript, would that help you remember what you told them?
probably.
Page 43. May I approach? You may. Just ask that you read that to yourself. I'd ask that you read that paragraph and see if that helps you remember what
This
you told
one
the
here?
police. Yes.
Okay. Read it out loud?
No, to yourself,
okay.
please.
Okay.
So what you told the police was that Brandon was mumbling and speaking in tongues, correct?
Right, yes,
And you were being honest with the police when you talked
yes,
to them.
yes.
So that's what you saw that day. I'm sorry, I see you
Oh,
nodding
I'm
again.
sorry, yes.
It's okay, I'm not trying to be difficult, but we do take it on
Okay,
record.
yeah, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I can always remind you. And you said you'd seen Brandon in the fetal position praying like that at church before.
Yes,
That was something he would do frequently
at the church, yes.
at the church. So that wasn't unusual for him to be in that position when he prayed at the church.
Yes, right.
And believe you've described it as he shuts the world off when he's praying,
Yes,
and when he's praying, he doesn't respond to anything else.
right,
You knew that about him.
yes,
I believe you've also described him as saying that he was always praying. I mean, that's something he did very frequently, right?
at church, yes.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you about when you first went into the house. You described here today that you patted Brandon on the back and talked to him and said, you know, something to the effect of, "Are you okay? What's going on?" Something like that.
Yeah.
That's actually not what you told the police back on the very day that this happened.
Oh, okay.
Let me show you what you told the police and see if it helps refresh your memory
Okay,
about what happened.
all right.
I'm just going to object to that part of the question, saying that I'm going to show, can we approach?
Sure. So that very day, the detective asked you if you tried to talk to Brandon or have any conversation when you went into the house. And your answer was no, you did not.
You mean a conversation with him? I just asked him if he was okay.
He said, did you try to talk to Brandon? Did you say what happened, or was there any conversation? That's what the officer asked you.
Okay,
And your response was no.
right.
Okay. So you told the officer you didn't talk to Brandon at all, you didn't ask him what was going on or if he was okay. That's what you told the officer that day.
Right, okay.
And you were being honest with the officer
Yeah,
that day.
yeah,
You were telling him what happened,
yeah.
being truthful. And again, it's been over 4 years. Your memory was better just a couple hours after this happened.
Objection, Your Honor. It's been less than 4 years. Counsel can say almost 4 years, but it's not been over 4 years.
The jury can do the math between October.
I apologize, I miscounted. It's been, I think, a little over 3.5 years, if I'm doing the math correctly. It's been a while. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. And you talked to the police the very day this all happened,
I guess,
and you told them what happened, to the best of your ability.
to the best of my ability, yeah.
You were being honest with them.
Yes.
I believe you said some things a little while ago about talking about when Brandon was brought out of the house.
Okay.
Do you remember Attorney Agati asking you some questions about that a little earlier?
Okay.
And you basically described that Brandon walked right by you.
Right.
And at that point, Brandon looked solemn,
Yes, he did.
and he did not say anything.
No,
At that point.
not that I remember, no.
Okay. Now, back on October 1st of 2019, that's the day we're talking about, Brandon had a cell phone, correct?
Correct.
You knew he had a cell phone,
Uh-huh.
and you knew he carried that phone with him,
Yes.
that he always had that on him.
As far as I know, yeah.
Your Honor, may we approach?
Yes, you may. We break the schedule, and I forgot, because normally I start these trials in the morning. This one started after my drug court session. So the way the trial flow goes is we start usually every morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Normally I have some things I have to deal with on other matters at 8:30. So we start at 9, then we go for a mid-morning break, an hour for lunch, and then and sometimes it's at 12, sometimes it's at 12:15, it depends on where we are. And then a mid-afternoon break, and then we try to conclude a little bit before 4, because I have to have everybody out of here by 4:15, and she has to be done by 4. So,
All your
it's
fault.
all his fault. No, it's a convenience for everybody. So we're going to stop a little bit before 4 every day, and now is a good time to break, which means, ma'am, you'll have to be back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to resume your testimony. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to excuse you now. Do not do any independent research. Do not discuss the case amongst yourselves. Do not pay any attention to any media. Resist the social media interaction about this case. And we'll see you all tomorrow morning. Thank you.
All right.
And you can remain seated. You can remain seated. Thank you. Okay, Ms. Pestana? Ms. Pestana? So because you're on cross-examination, means that you are not allowed to discuss your testimony with anybody until we resume tomorrow morning at 9, okay?
Okay, yeah.
All right.
Okay.
And I'll make sure I have plenty of cough drops for you, okay?
Oh.
I hope you feel better.
Yeah.
Thank you. Counsel, do we need to discuss anything before we adjourn for the day?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. See you tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Will do.